When I opened the door and saw my ex-husband standing on the threshold of that forgotten hotel, holding his overnight bag and looking as surprised as I was, my breath caught in my throat, but not out of shock. It was something else. Something deeper. I stepped back instinctively, but my brother was already behind me, grinning too wide, too satisfied, as if he had been waiting for this exact reaction. "You remember each other," he said casually, like this was some sort of joke or reunion I had signed up for. My ex shifted his weight from one foot to the other and muttered something like, "Didn't expect this," but the look in his eyes wasn't confusion, it was resignation. He knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew enough. The air in the hallway grew heavier. My fingers clenched around the doorknob behind me, suddenly unsure of whether I should step forward or slam the door shut. I could feel it all coming back, not just the memories of our marriage, or the way things ended, but the things left unsaid. The nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a mistake, and the mornings I convinced myself that silence was safer than truth. Now here he was, with the same tired eyes, the same quiet tension in his jaw. But something about this wasn't right. It wasn't random. And I didn't believe for one second that this was just a coincidence. My brother stepped between us, tossed a wink in my direction, and said, "You two should catch up. I'll go unpack." I stood frozen, my heart hammering, not because of who was at the door, but because of who had opened it for him. There's a story here, one I never meant to tell. A story not about betrayal, but about something far more complicated. More fragile. And before I tell you everything, before I lay out the pieces of a puzzle I still don't fully understand, answer this one thing in the comments. Have you ever felt like someone you trusted was playing a game you didn't know you were a part of? Tell me where you're watching this from. And then let me tell you how everything started. Before the first message. Before the first kiss. Before I understood what he was truly after. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, slipped between unpaid bills and supermarket flyers. Just a short note in my brother's handwriting, quick, careless, like always. "Come to the old hotel this weekend. You need a break. I'll be there. Just us. Like old times." There was no question mark, no warmth. Just an expectation. And, somehow, that was enough. I hadn't been to that place in years. It had been part of our childhood, our family's brief attempt at business before it became a memory we all quietly agreed to forget. The hotel was old, made of stone and silence, buried in the woods off a broken road. Back then, it felt like a maze full of secrets. I never expected to return, and yet, 3 days later, I packed a small bag and drove toward it. Not because I missed the building. Because I missed someone thinking of me. My brother was waiting outside when I pulled in. He leaned against the railing with a beer in hand, grinning like he'd already won something. The paint was peeling. The wooden steps creaked beneath my boots. He didn't offer to carry my bag, just opened the door and motioned me inside. The air smelled like dust and pine. My room was already made up. The sheets were crisp, too clean for a forgotten place. It felt staged. But I didn't say anything. That night, we sat in the kitchen, the one with yellowed cabinets and an old gas stove that always hissed before it lit. He cooked pasta and poured wine, and we ate like nothing had changed. He asked about my work, my house, my sleep. All in that same teasing tone he always used, like he was poking me to see where I'd flinch. I answered with half-truths, keeping the details shallow. He didn't ask about my ex-husband. And I didn't bring him up. Later, after he'd gone to bed, I wandered the halls alone. The old floorboards groaned beneath me, familiar and haunting. I stopped in front of one door, our parents' old room. It was locked. I didn't try the handle. Instead, I walked back to mine and stood by the window, watching the woods sway under the moonlight. I slept fitfully, dreams tangled in silence. The next morning, something shifted. My brother was already up, coffee brewed, and the table set for 3. I raised an eyebrow, but he just smiled and said, "We've got help coming today." Just a friend. I didn't question it. I didn't want to ask. Around 10, I heard the gravel crunching outside. A car door slammed. Then, knocking. I opened the door. And there he was. My ex-husband. Same coat. Same hesitation. Same everything. He blinked once, the way he always did when he was caught off guard but refused to show it. I blinked back. We said nothing. Then my brother appeared behind me and clapped a hand on his shoulder like they were old pals, said something about reconnecting, about how it's good for people to work through things. My body went cold. My brain didn't know which emotion to choose: shock, anger, disbelief, guilt. I wanted to shut the door. But I didn't. I stepped aside. The next few hours passed in a daze. My ex helped move boxes. I pretended to clean windows. My brother floated between us, a conductor without an orchestra, always watching. Always smiling. In the late afternoon, we sat in the common room, just the 3 of us, like some distorted family photo. My brother poured drinks, told stories from our childhood that twisted slightly in the telling. My ex listened, laughed in the right places, but I noticed how his eyes kept landing on me, like he was searching for the version of me that used to exist. When it grew dark, I excused myself early. I didn't say goodnight. I didn't ask questions. In my room, I changed into an old t-shirt and lay on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan that didn't spin. I tried to steady my breath, to quiet my thoughts. But they were already too loud. Something was wrong. And whatever it was, it had only just begun. The morning after he arrived, the silence between us wasn't awkward, it was calculated. I woke up earlier than usual and went downstairs barefoot, careful not to make noise on the old staircase. The hallway smelled like coffee and the distant hum of conversation leaked from the kitchen. I hesitated at the doorway, listening. My brother's voice was steady, amused. My ex-husband's laugh, faint, uncomfortable, followed. I walked in just as my brother poured him a cup of coffee and nodded at me, overly casual, like this was routine. We all sat at the same table. The same one we'd used for holidays, where our mother used to serve food without ever sitting down. The chairs still creaked in the same rhythm. My brother slid a mug toward me and asked about my sleep. I answered with a polite smile. My ex barely looked at me, but his hands wrapped too tightly around his cup. It was cold outside, but he looked flushed. We spent most of the day working. My brother handed out tasks like a manager. He assigned me to the upstairs storage rooms and sent my ex out back to clear old furniture into the barn. The division seemed random, but I knew better. He didn't want us alone yet. I spent hours opening dusty cabinets and folding old sheets into piles that no one would use. The wallpaper curled at the edges. Time had made everything soft and yellowed. I found an old photo album tucked behind a row of cracked vases. It wasn't labeled, but when I opened it, I found pictures of us. Me, my brother, and my ex. There were photos from our wedding. One of my brother holding the microphone and giving a speech I didn't remember. One of me laughing, leaning into my ex, unaware of the camera. My hands trembled slightly as I closed it and slid it back. In the afternoon, my brother insisted we take a break. "Fresh air's good for your head," he said, handing me a coat. We sat out back in silence, facing the woods. The trees were still bare, stubborn against spring. He asked me how I felt seeing my ex again. I shrugged, said it was strange but fine. He smirked, tilted his head. "Fine's not a real answer," he said. I didn't reply. Later, I helped him prepare dinner. My ex returned near sunset, his boots muddy, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked exhausted, but lighter somehow. He smelled like dust and pine. I tried not to notice. Dinner was uneventful until my brother brought out a bottle of wine from our parents' collection. He claimed it was a special occasion. He poured 3 glasses, made a toast to the beauty of reconnection, and raised his glass. We all drank. I felt the warmth of the wine sink into my chest, calming and dangerous. Afterward, I stepped outside alone, walking to the edge of the property, to where the trees began. The wind was cool and sharp. I leaned against the fence, trying to sort through the noise in my head. When I turned back, he was standing there, my ex, a few feet away, hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. The distance between us closed slowly, like it always had. I saw the questions in his face, and maybe he saw mine. I couldn't tell if he'd come to me or if I had pulled him closer with some unspoken gesture. It didn't matter. We kissed. It was brief. Familiar. Not hungry or desperate, just full of old weight and recognition. Like an exhale we'd both held too long. When we pulled apart, I looked away first. Back inside, I avoided my brother. I didn't know what my face might reveal, and I wasn't ready for his gaze. I went straight to my room, undressed in the dark, and lay beneath the blankets, fully clothed. My heart beat slow but deep, echoing. There was no guilt. But there wasn't relief either. Just quiet. Heavy and wide. And I knew that was only the beginning. The morning air felt colder than usual, or maybe it was me. I stood at the sink in the kitchen, watching steam rise from the kettle while the floor creaked above me. Someone was awake. The moment felt delicate, like porcelain balanced on the edge of a table, one sudden shift, and everything could shatter. I hadn't spoken a word about the kiss. Neither had he. It lingered between us in silence, stretched taut like a wire. That kind of silence wasn't heavy, though. It was sharp, alert. It made me question every look, every movement, every breath. I knew that if my brother had seen us, even suspected, he'd say something. But he hadn't. He just hummed softly that morning as he entered the kitchen, ruffling my hair like I was still his little sister. He poured himself coffee, said something about how today would be busy, and told my ex to help clear the cellar. Then, as if the words had no weight at all, he asked me to join him upstairs to go through the linen closets. I nodded, pretending not to hear the undertone. We worked in different rooms most of the morning. I refolded old blankets and rearranged drawers. He carried boxes from one end of the hallway to the other. Occasionally, we passed in the hall, each offering a small nod. No smiles. No tension. But not neutral either. When I bent down to lift a box, I noticed an old notebook tucked behind the dresser. It had my handwriting on the cover, my maiden name, written in the script I used in high school. I opened it, expecting school notes, maybe a forgotten diary entry. Instead, it was blank. Every page. Clean, untouched. I don't know why that unsettled me more than if it had been full. Downstairs, my ex was moving furniture. I could hear the scrape of wood against wood, the occasional thud when something heavy dropped. The sound became background noise, almost rhythmic, grounding me while everything inside me felt like it was loosening. Just before lunch, my brother suggested we eat outside. He carried the sandwiches and thermos of soup, and we sat at the old wooden table behind the house, the one warped from years of weather. The 3 of us barely spoke. The only real sounds were birds and the wind moving through the trees. At one point, my ex asked about the cellar repairs. My brother answered vaguely, but something about his tone made me glance at him longer than I should have. He caught my look and smiled, not kindly, but knowingly. That smile unsettled me more than I cared to admit. After lunch, my ex returned to the cellar, and my brother asked if I could help him carry some things from the attic. I hesitated. The attic had always been the coldest place in the house, emotionally, not just physically. It had been our father's storage area, filled with unsorted boxes and silence. I followed him anyway. He walked a few steps ahead of me on the narrow staircase, moving slowly, as if inviting me to look at him. I didn't. Once upstairs, he pointed toward a stack of crates near the wall. I noticed the room had been cleaned recently, far cleaner than it should have been for a place no one visited. He opened a box and started pulling out old linens, gesturing for me to help sort. I obeyed without speaking. For a while, the only sound was fabric unfolding. Then he spoke. Not about the linens or the attic, but about me. You seem lighter, he said, not looking at me. Like you've exhaled something you were holding in too long. I didn't respond. I focused on the patterns of the folded fabric in my hands, the faded colors, the torn edges. But I felt his gaze shift to me, searching. I was just thinking, he continued, how much we change without noticing. You used to hate this place. Now you're walking through it like you own it. Still, I said nothing. His voice dropped lower. It's good to see you alive again. That word, alive, clung to the air. I left the attic a few minutes later, using the excuse of a headache. He didn't stop me. He just watched me go. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand what was happening. Not just between me and my ex. Between me and everything. The hotel. The memories. My brother. There was a rhythm to it all now, one I hadn't agreed to dance to, but couldn't seem to escape. That evening, the three of us cooked together. It was too quiet, too practiced. My ex and I exchanged barely any words, and my brother filled the silence with anecdotes from our childhood, most of which I didn't remember the way he told them. He made himself the hero in every story. I let him. After dinner, my brother insisted we all play cards. He brought out an old deck and dealt 3 hands at the kitchen table. The light overhead buzzed faintly. Outside, the wind picked up. He asked simple questions, about our childhood, about the last time we'd all been in this house together. Then he asked my ex what he remembered about our wedding. My ex paused, answered with something polite, something distant. My brother chuckled and said, I remember how you looked at her during the vows. Like she was the answer to a question you were too afraid to ask. I folded my cards and excused myself. In my room, I closed the door, pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, and breathed. Everything felt off-kilter. Familiar and foreign all at once. Like a house I'd known in dreams but never in waking life. I thought about the kiss. About what it meant and what it didn't. I thought about how it hadn't felt wrong. How it hadn't felt like anything I should run from. I thought about my brother's words, his tone, his timing. I started to wonder who was really orchestrating this weekend, and who I had become for letting it all happen. I didn't sleep much that night. The air in the room was too still, the silence too purposeful, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I kept the window cracked open, hoping the cool air would anchor me to something outside of myself. But even the wind seemed reluctant to enter. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old building, each one like a whisper I couldn't quite decipher. By morning, I had convinced myself that I needed space. From the house, from the silence, from the looks exchanged and the ones avoided. I dressed quickly, threw on a coat, and walked outside before anyone else had stirred. The path that led into the woods behind the hotel was overgrown, but my feet remembered it. I didn't hesitate. The trees formed a quiet corridor. Dead leaves crunched underfoot, birds rustled somewhere above, and my breath turned to mist in the early cold. I walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more, until I reached the small clearing where my brother and I used to build makeshift forts. There was nothing left of them now, just moss-covered stones and the vague shape of old logs. I sat on one of them and tried to breathe deeply. But the stillness was too loud. My thoughts refused to stay still. They wandered, twisting through everything that had happened in the last few days. The invitation. The unexpected reunion. The kiss. The attic. The stories that weren't quite true. I didn't know what unsettled me more, what had happened, or what hadn't yet. Eventually, I made my way back. The house looked quiet from the outside. No smoke from the chimney. No sounds from within. I pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth of the kitchen. The table was set for 3, but no one was there. I found my brother in the den, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a pile of old photo albums spread around him. He looked up and smiled like nothing was wrong. Like everything was exactly as it should be. He motioned to the albums, said he was sorting through them for a display he wanted to make for the foyer. I nodded and knelt beside him. I told myself I was only staying for a minute. The photos were familiar, yet slightly off. Some were cropped differently than I remembered. In one, my ex stood beside me with his arm around my waist, but I could have sworn that photo had once included my brother too. In another, my mother's face was turned away, though I remembered her looking at the camera directly. It was like viewing the past through a warped mirror. My brother picked up one photo and held it between us. It was from our last summer at the hotel years ago, before anything fell apart. He pointed to the background, to a bench near the corner of the frame. "That's still there," he said, "we should repaint it." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. My ex entered the room a few minutes later, hair damp from a shower, sleeves rolled up. He looked at the photos, then at me, and his expression tightened. Not angry, not confused, just cautious. He asked what we were doing, and my brother replied too cheerfully. "Just a trip down memory lane," he said. We all looked at each other then, 3 people in a room full of curated memories, each pretending not to see the frayed edges. Later that afternoon, my brother announced that we needed to clear out the old chapel room. It hadn't been used in decades, and I'd almost forgotten it existed. It was a small space at the far end of the hotel, past a hallway that sagged in the middle. The door stuck slightly, and when we finally got it open, the smell of dust and wood polish hit me like a wave. The chapel wasn't much, just a dozen wooden chairs, a lectern, and stained glass windows that had lost most of their color. Light filtered through in muted tones, casting faded patterns on the floor. It was beautiful, in a tired kind of way. My brother suggested we rearrange the chairs, maybe refinish them. He said it might make a nice meditation room. I wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. My ex and I worked side by side, moving the chairs without speaking. Occasionally, our hands brushed, but we pretended not to notice. The room seemed to shrink the longer we stayed inside, the silence stretching, pressing. At one point, he paused and looked at me, not with expectation, not with regret, just a quiet sort of acknowledgement. As if to say, "I know you're in this with me, even if we don't know where this is going." We didn't say anything. That evening, my brother prepared a fire outside, near the edge of the property. He brought out a blanket and 3 chairs, poured hot cider into mismatched mugs, and insisted we all sit together. The fire crackled. The sky darkened. My brother told stories again, some real, some not. He talked about our parents, about summers we'd spent here, about games we played and secrets we kept. But the stories were too polished, too well-timed. They didn't feel like memories. They felt like monologues. I noticed my ex watching him carefully, his jaw tight. I didn't ask what he was thinking. I didn't want to know, not yet. When the fire died down, my brother excused himself, saying he needed to check something in the basement. He left us there, the silence immediately more honest. My ex leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He didn't look at me. His voice was low when he finally spoke. I'm not sure what this is. But it doesn't feel like coincidence. I said nothing. Because he was right. He looked at me then, really looked. Are you okay? I nodded. I wasn't lying. I wasn't entirely telling the truth either. We sat there for a long time, until the cold started to creep in. When we finally stood, neither of us moved toward the house right away. We just stood beside each other, watching the last embers fade. Back in my room, I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the bed. I didn't turn on the light. The darkness felt softer somehow. My body ached, not from labor but from the weight of questions I couldn't shake. What did my brother want from me? Why now? Why like this? And why couldn't I look away from any of it? I didn't sleep. Not really. Just drifted in and out, caught between dreams and memory, between discomfort and curiosity. The kind of sleep that feels more like waiting. Waiting for what, I still didn't know. The day began with a quiet tension that wrapped itself around the house like fog. I could feel it in the air before I even opened my eyes. The floorboards creaked differently that morning, slower, more deliberate. Footsteps above, then silence. A cupboard door opened somewhere in the distance, and then the familiar clink of cups being placed gently on the counter. It was routine, but beneath the ordinary rhythm was something watchful, like someone was holding their breath. I got dressed slowly, deliberately, my body moving out of habit more than intention. My reflection in the mirror looked tired but alert, like a person midway through solving a puzzle without knowing what the final image would be. I tied my hair back, pulled on a sweater that smelled faintly of cedar, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the table was set. 3 mugs of coffee, still steaming. One seat pulled out slightly, like someone had just left it. I paused for a moment, then reached for my cup and wrapped my hands around it. The warmth helped, if only a little. My brother appeared a few minutes later. He was dressed for work with jeans, flannel, gloves shoved in his back pocket. He smiled when he saw me, and I returned it with a nod. No words. None were needed. He grabbed his coffee, sipped, then told me we had a small plumbing issue in the back of the house and that he needed help. I followed him outside, through the narrow path that led behind the kitchen. The cold bit at my skin, but I welcomed it. We reached the old maintenance shed, and he handed me a flashlight. I knelt to hold it steady while he examined a pipe below the deck. The position brought us closer than comfort allowed. I tried to focus on the beam of light, but his shoulder brushed mine, and he didn't move. He said something about how I was always the patient one, how I used to sit still for hours when we played games as kids, never rushing, always waiting. I didn't answer. I just kept the flashlight steady. After a while, the task was done, and we walked back in silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel finished. Inside, I found my ex in the dining room, going through a box of old guest records. He looked up when I entered, and his expression shifted. Not surprise, not discomfort, just something unreadable. Something aware. We spent the morning organizing the office. The room had been untouched for years. Dust coated everything. The desk, the bookshelves, the window panes. We worked side by side, and at times our arms brushed as we reached for the same item. Neither of us reacted. We moved with a kind of mutual understanding, like dancers performing a routine they hadn't rehearsed but somehow knew by instinct. In one drawer, I found an old guest book from the late 90s. Flipping through the pages, I paused on one entry written in unfamiliar handwriting. Time here moves slower, but not safer. There was no name. Just the date and those 9 words. I didn't mention it to him. I just closed the book and placed it back. Lunch came and went with little conversation. My brother was unusually quiet, his eyes darting between me and my ex more than usual. He didn't speak about our plans for the afternoon. Instead, he suggested we each take time to ourselves. Separate corners, he called it, with a smirk. I took his advice and walked the perimeter of the property. The sun was low even in early afternoon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted grass. My mind drifted in loops, replaying moments, reanalyzing looks, searching for patterns. But the more I thought, the less I understood. When I returned to the house, I found my ex sitting on the floor of the hallway outside the old piano room. He held a book in his hands but wasn't reading. He looked up at me as I approached and asked if I remembered the summer we painted the porch steps. I did. He said he had thought about it often. I didn't ask why. I just sat beside him. We stayed that way for a while. Not speaking. Not needing to. The kind of silence that had weight and warmth, not avoidance. Later, my brother called us to the parlor. He said he had found something special and wanted to show us. On the table was an old photo album I hadn't seen in decades. He opened it slowly, turning page after page, pointing out moments frozen in time. Us as children. Family picnics. Birthday parties. Then pictures of me and my ex, our wedding, our honeymoon, the first apartment. I couldn't tell what he wanted from us by showing these. Whether it was nostalgia or strategy. His voice was calm, his hands steady, but his eyes searched us both as if waiting for a reaction. Afterward, we returned to the living room. The fire had been lit earlier, and its soft crackling filled the room. I sat on one end of the couch, my ex on the other. My brother stayed standing for a moment, then announced he had something to check upstairs and left. The room grew quieter once he was gone. The fire hissed, the wood settled. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows. My ex leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I watched him for a moment, then turned toward the flames. We didn't speak. We didn't move. Then, slowly, he shifted closer. Not by much. Just enough. And we kissed. It was quiet. Simple. The kind of kiss that holds more questions than answers. When it ended, we sat back without a word. No explanations. No apologies. Only the shared understanding of a moment that couldn't be undone. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of guilt or confusion. But because everything was beginning to feel like a design I hadn't drawn, a story I hadn't written, yet one I was living line by line. And somewhere in the house, I knew my brother was still awake. The next morning unfolded with the slow rhythm of something inevitable. The kind of day where nothing dramatic happens outwardly, but every word, every movement feels soaked in quiet meaning. I didn't rush to get dressed. I lingered by the window longer than usual, watching fog drift through the trees like breath on glass. It was early, and the house still felt asleep. But I knew it wasn't. When I finally made my way to the kitchen, my brother was already there. He stood by the stove, flipping something in a skillet, humming an old tune under his breath. His face was calm, pleasant even, but there was something practiced in his posture. As though every motion had been rehearsed, and I was merely arriving for my part. He greeted me casually, handed me a plate, and made light conversation about the weather and the repairs that still needed doing. I nodded, gave the appropriate replies, but my mind wasn't present. I kept hearing the fire from the night before, feeling the memory of the kiss I hadn't talked about, trying to understand the shape of what I was falling into. My ex entered not long after. He looked rested but guarded. We made eye contact briefly, and then both turned away, as if by silent agreement. There was no need for pretense between us anymore, but no permission either. We sat across from each other like we had a dozen times before, but this time the distance felt alive. After breakfast, my brother proposed a project. He suggested we move a few pieces of furniture from one of the storage rooms to the front parlor. He claimed it was time to open up the space again. It deserves light, he said. I wasn't sure whether he was talking about the room or something else. We spent the next 2 hours hauling dusty chairs and small cabinets down the hallway. My ex and I worked in rhythm, a silent, steady, efficient. My brother drifted between helping and observing, always nearby, always commenting just enough to insert himself into the moment. In the middle of the move, we found an old writing desk tucked behind a large armoire. It had once belonged to our father. I remembered it from my childhood, the way he used to sit at it late at night, scribbling in ledgers, muttering to himself. My brother dusted it off gently, ran his hand across the top as though greeting an old friend. He insisted we bring it downstairs, but before we did, he opened one of the drawers. Inside were a few yellowed pages, some loose photographs, and a pen. He handed the photos to me without a word. They were of us. Not the three of us together, but me and him. Young. Smiling. Sitting on the front steps, leaning too close. In one, his arm was around my shoulders, my head tilted toward him. Nothing inappropriate, on the surface. But the framing, the timing, the look in our eyes, it told a different story. I didn't say anything. I handed them back and moved to the other side of the room. I heard him sigh quietly before tucking them into his back pocket. We brought the desk downstairs and positioned it near the front windows. It fit strangely well, as if the house had been waiting for it to return. My brother admired it with a pleased expression, then disappeared into the kitchen, claiming he needed to check something in the pantry. Left alone, my ex and I stood in the parlor, surrounded by rearranged furniture and the faint smell of dust. The light from the window cast long shadows across the floor. He looked at me, and I could see the question forming in his expression. I shook my head before he spoke. I wasn't ready to answer anything yet. Later, my brother reappeared with a bottle of wine. He said he'd found it in the cellar, one of the last good ones. He insisted we open it, though it was still early in the afternoon. We sat around the dining table, and he poured generous servings. The first few sips were quiet. Then came the stories again. He started reminiscing about our childhood, his words unusually tender. He spoke of how he always looked out for me, how he carried me home when I twisted my ankle one summer, how I cried when I thought he wouldn't come back from camp. His tone was warm, nostalgic, layered with affection. But under it was something else. A kind of possession. Then, he turned the conversation toward my ex. He asked about our early years of marriage, about when things started to change. He smiled as he asked, but it was the kind of smile that pressed for discomfort. My ex answered vaguely, cautiously, avoiding anything too revealing. But the tension began to rise. My brother laughed. You both always had your secrets, he said, raising his glass. Sometimes I wonder if either of you ever said what you really meant. No one responded. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. A walk through the side garden, a broken fence post repaired, a shared silence in the hallway near the back stairs. I found myself constantly aware of where everyone was, even when I tried not to be. Every room felt smaller. Every glance lingered. By evening, I needed air. I left the house without telling anyone and walked toward the hill behind the property, the one with the half-collapsed bench near the ridge. I hadn't been up there in years. The climb was steep, the trail mostly lost, but my body remembered the way. When I reached the top, the view stopped me. The valley stretched out below, dipped in golden light from the fading sun. The hotel looked smaller from up here, less imposing, less manipulative. I sat on the grass, let my legs stretch out, and let the silence settle around me. I heard him approaching before I saw him. The crunch of gravel, the quiet pace. My ex. He didn't speak as he sat down beside me. We watched the sun drop lower, the sky turning from amber to deep blue. Eventually, he asked me what I was thinking. I said I didn't know. I told him it felt like the ground was shifting under me, like I'd stepped into a story someone else had written. He nodded slowly. He said he'd felt it too. The feeling of being placed, not choosing. We sat there long after the sun had gone. When we returned, the house was dark except for the lamp in the foyer. My brother wasn't in sight, but I knew he knew where we had been. He always knew. I went to my room, not because I was tired, but because there was nowhere else left to go. I closed the door gently, sat on the bed, and listened. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no creaks on the stairs. Just the soft hush of night, holding its breath. The morning light crept through the curtains with a softness that didn't match the weight I felt pressing against my chest. It had been days since I arrived, but time no longer felt linear. It folded in on itself, like pages of a book read out of order. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to name what exactly had changed overnight. Something subtle had shifted, inside me, around me. Maybe both. I got out of bed slowly, moving through the room like someone recovering from a fever. My body didn't ache, but it felt foreign, as if it remembered something I was trying to forget. The air was cool against my skin as I walked barefoot to the window. Outside, the world was still. The trees stood motionless, heavy with silence. Nothing stirred. It was as if the house had drawn a breath and was waiting for me to exhale. Downstairs, I found the dining table already set. My brother sat at the far end, sipping coffee, a newspaper folded neatly in front of him. He looked up as I entered, offered a half-smile, and gestured toward the empty chair beside him. I hesitated but took the seat. We exchanged pleasantries. He commented on the weather. I nodded, murmured something in return. The conversation floated above the surface, careful and sparse. Nothing about the previous day. Nothing about where I had gone or with whom. But beneath it all, something unspoken pulsed like a second heartbeat. He knew. And I knew he knew. My ex entered a few minutes later. His posture was more rigid than usual, his movements calculated. He greeted us politely, took his seat across from me, and began eating in silence. The air between us felt too still. We didn't look at each other. But the memory of last night pressed itself into the space between every bite, every sip, every breath. After breakfast, my brother suggested a short drive into town. He said the car needed gas and he wanted to pick up some supplies. He asked my ex to come with him. The invitation sounded like an order, cloaked in casual tone. My ex hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I didn't speak. I didn't ask to come along. I wasn't sure if I was being left behind or deliberately kept. Once they were gone, the house became something else. Not empty, just quieter in a different way. The kind of quiet that lets you hear your own heartbeat. I wandered from room to room without direction, eventually ending up in the old library. Dust clung to the shelves, and the air smelled of forgotten pages and dried wood. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, stopping occasionally to pull one out, only to return it moments later. On a low shelf near the window, I found a leather-bound notebook tucked behind a row of hard covers. It didn't belong there. Its surface was worn, the edges frayed. I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with notes, some scribbled hastily, others written in long, deliberate lines. At first, I thought it was my father's handwriting, but as I read more, I realized it wasn't. They were my brother's notes. Observations. Descriptions. References to dates, emotions, patterns. Some pages had diagrams, floor plans, furniture arrangements, schedules. I flipped to the middle and froze. There was my name. Repeated. Over and over again. Different contexts. She withdraws after contact. Prefers silence when overwhelmed. Avoids eye contact when uncertain. Leans toward the window when lost in thought. It wasn't a journal. It was a study. I closed the notebook slowly, returned it to its place, and left the room. I spent the next hour outside, walking the edge of the property. The grass was damp, the sky overcast. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the urge. What I felt was more precise than sadness, something closer to recognition. A confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect but hadn't yet allowed myself to name. When I returned, the car was back in the driveway. My brother and my ex were unloading bags from the trunk. I approached slowly, watching them from a distance. They moved in sync, like they had rehearsed the choreography. My brother saw me first. He smiled and called out that they'd picked up wine for dinner. His voice was easy. Controlled. The rest of the day passed in small tasks. We cleaned the porch, sorted old linens, prepped the kitchen for dinner. The three of us moved through the house like planets orbiting a shared gravity, always close, never colliding. Dinner was quiet. My brother asked us questions we didn't know how to answer. About our plans after the weekend. About what it had been like, being together again. My ex responded with vague niceties. I stayed silent. Afterward, my brother suggested we play a game in the living room. Something light, he said. Something from our childhood. He pulled out an old board game, dusted it off, and set it on the coffee table. We sat on the floor like children, pieces in our hands, laughter on our lips, but it wasn't real. It was performance. All of it. At one point, my ex leaned back and asked for more wine. My brother rose to refill his glass, and I watched him walk to the kitchen. The curve of his back, the way his hand lingered on the counter. Everything about him was too measured. I stood up. Said I was tired. And left the room. But I didn't go to bed. Instead, I went to the kitchen once they had settled back into their game. I poured myself water, stood at the sink, and stared out into the dark yard. That's when he came in. My brother. He moved behind me slowly, reached for the drawer beside my hand, pretending to look for something. I didn't move. He leaned closer than necessary, his shoulder brushing mine. You seemed distant tonight, he said softly. I didn't reply. You always do that when you're unsure, he added, stepping back. I turned toward him. He looked at me the way someone looks at a piece of art they've studied too long, both admiring and dissecting. I'm not unsure, I said. He tilted his head, as if surprised by the firmness in my voice. I left the kitchen without waiting for a response. Later that night, when the lights were off and the house was still again, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow. Measured. I didn't get up to see where they were going. I didn't want to know. But I also didn't sleep. Because I knew, deep down, that this was the moment everything changed. And I was already too far in to step away. We spent the night together. The morning after was not filled with guilt. Nor with clarity. It simply was. The house looked the same. The sun cast its usual tired light through the smudged windows. The birds outside chirped with the same mechanical indifference. And I moved through the hallways with the same body I had always worn, only now it carried something unspoken beneath the skin. I avoided the kitchen, knowing he would be there. I didn't want to face the space where the ordinary would once again try to overwrite the extraordinary. Instead, I went outside, stepping carefully down the back porch and into the frost-covered grass. The wind had a bite to it, but I welcomed the sting. It reminded me I was still capable of feeling. I stood near the edge of the property for a long time, my arms folded over my chest, watching the tops of the trees sway against the pale sky. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I didn't even think in complete sentences. I just stood there, holding stillness like a shield, knowing that everything had changed and that none of it could be undone. When I came back inside, both of them were sitting in the living room. My brother with a book open in his lap, my ex pretending to read a magazine. They both looked up when I entered. I didn't stop walking. I nodded slightly and kept going, past them, up the stairs, into the guest room that had become mine. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall for a long time. Eventually, my brother knocked. Lightly. 3 times. Not impatient. Not tentative. Just rhythmic. I didn't answer. After a pause, I heard his voice through the door. "We're going into town later. Let me know if you want anything." I stayed silent. After he walked away, I found myself pacing. Not with purpose, but with momentum. My mind raced, but my body stayed calm, like I had trained it not to respond until called upon. I sat at the small writing desk, opened the drawer, and found a half-used notepad. I flipped through it, found pages filled with old lists, groceries, to-do items, phone numbers with no names. I turned to a clean sheet and stared at it for a while. Then I wrote one word, why. I didn't add a question mark. I didn't need one. Later, I came downstairs to find my brother alone in the kitchen. He looked up from the stove and smiled, not with teeth, but with something close to satisfaction. There was no performance in him today. No friendly small talk. Just a man cooking eggs and waiting to be seen. He offered me a plate. I declined. He didn't insist. The silence between us stretched out, not sharp, not angry, but thick. Intentional. He asked me if I had slept well. I said nothing. He didn't press. Then he said, "You don't have to keep pretending." Not here. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I already knew. So I turned and left the room, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know how to stay without asking him the kind of questions that would break something open. My ex found me later in the upstairs hallway. He didn't speak right away. He leaned against the opposite wall and watched me for a few seconds. Then, carefully, he said, "You've changed since we got here." I laughed once, quietly, without humor. He asked if I was okay. I nodded. Then shook my head. Then nodded again. He moved a step closer. I stepped back. The motion was automatic, not cruel. I just needed space that didn't feel like a decision. He asked me if I had regrets. I told him I didn't know yet. That afternoon, the 3 of us went for a walk around the property. My brother led the way, talking about the repairs he still wanted to make, about adding a greenhouse in the spring, about converting the tool shed into an artist's studio. My ex and I followed behind him, saying little. We stopped near the tree line, where the remnants of an old swing set still clung to the branches like ghosts. My brother pointed to it and said, "We should build something new here. Start over." I wasn't sure who he meant by we. Back at the house, I excused myself to the bathroom and instead wandered into the library again. I found the notebook where I had left it and flipped to the page I had marked. My name stared back at me. My habits, my patterns, my emotional defaults. It was all written there, as if I had been studied like a subject. My breath caught for a moment, not from surprise, but from recognition. It was one thing to suspect you were being observed. It was another to see it written down. I returned the notebook, careful to slide it back exactly as I'd found it. Then I went outside again, needing air. At the far edge of the yard, I saw my brother standing near the fire pit, poking at the ashes with a stick. He didn't turn when I approached. He said, "You're quieter today." I said, "You're not." He smiled at that, still not looking at me. Then he said, "You've always tried to live without making a mess. But life isn't clean. It's honest, or it's nothing." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. That night, after dinner, I went to my room early. I packed a small bag, not to leave, but because I needed the gesture. I needed to feel like I could leave, even if I didn't. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bag beside me, the house silent around me. I thought about everything I'd felt since arriving: confusion, anger, desire, resistance, surrender. I tried to rank them, to categorize them, but none of them were separate. They lived in the same place. They were part of the same movement. I lay down eventually, fully clothed, eyes open to the dark. There were no footsteps in the hallway that night. No knocks on my door. But I still didn't sleep. Because I knew the real silence always comes after the storm. And whatever storm I had just passed through, whatever storm I had helped create, it wasn't over. It had just shifted shape. The sky was a dull gray when I woke, the kind of color that made everything below it seem paused, as if the world had taken a breath and was waiting to exhale. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, my hands clasped loosely in my lap, eyes fixed on the floor. The bag I had packed the night before still sat beside the dresser, untouched. I hadn't moved it, hadn't unzipped it. It was neither a plan nor a threat. It was just a shape in the room, like everything else I didn't yet understand. Downstairs, the house was quiet. No footsteps. No voices. No dishes clinking in the kitchen. I moved slowly, listening. The air felt different, not heavy, not thick with tension, but thin, stretched. As if something had broken and hadn't yet been acknowledged. I found my ex standing in the front hallway, looking out the window toward the driveway. He didn't hear me approach. When he turned, his expression was one of resignation more than surprise. He asked if I'd slept. I said yes, though it wasn't true. He said he hadn't either. That part, I believed. He told me he was leaving today. That he'd already spoken to my brother. That he thought it was time. I didn't try to change his mind. I didn't ask him to stay. There was a quiet acceptance between us, like two people at the edge of a story that had already been told too many times. We didn't hug. We didn't promise to talk later. He just nodded, and I nodded back, and a few hours later, I watched him drive away. The silence after he left was different than before. Not expectant. Not charged. Just still. I found my brother in the backyard, near the tree line. He was raking leaves into uneven piles, though the wind kept scattering them before he could finish. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands dirt-streaked. He didn't look up when I joined him. He asked if I'd said goodbye. I said yes. He said, "You didn't try to stop him." I said, "Neither did you." He didn't respond. We worked side by side in silence for a while, raking leaves, then collecting them into old canvas sacks. The motion helped. It gave my hands something to do while my mind tried to sort through the fragments of the past days. At one point, he paused, leaned on the rake, and looked at me. There was no accusation in his face. No apology either. He said, "He was never right for you." I asked, "And you are?" He didn't flinch. He just said, "I've always been." I didn't answer. I went back to the leaves. Later, back inside, I took a long shower. I let the water run until the mirror fogged and the heat began to sting. I stood there with my eyes closed, letting the weight of everything run down my back and into the drain. There were no revelations. No clarity. But there was quiet. Sometimes, that was enough. When I came out, the house smelled like cinnamon and apples. My brother was in the kitchen, baking. The scent was comforting in a way I couldn't explain. Like something simple had been rebuilt in the middle of the complexity. He offered me a slice of the tart while it was still warm. I took it, ate slowly, chewing each bite with care, like it mattered. We sat at the table together for a long time, neither of us speaking. The light outside dimmed gradually, slipping from silver to gold to a soft, reluctant blue. He finally broke the silence. "You could leave now," he said. "The car is gassed up. Roads are clear. No one would stop you." I looked at him. His face was unreadable, his tone flat. I asked, "Do you want me to leave?" He said, "That's not the question." I didn't press. That night, I didn't go to my room. Instead, I sat in the library, curled in the corner armchair with a blanket over my knees. The fire in the small stove crackled softly, giving off more light than heat. I watched the flames dance and tried not to think. But thoughts came anyway. I thought about how many times I had asked myself why I came. Why I stayed. Why I didn't stop what had begun to happen the moment I stepped through the door. I thought about my ex, about how easy it had been to fall back into something familiar, even when I knew it no longer fit. I thought about my brother, about the way he watched, waited, maneuvered. And I thought about myself. About the woman I had become. About the woman I had allowed myself to be. Sometime after midnight, I heard his footsteps. Not cautious. Not secret. Just present. They stopped at the doorway. I didn't look up. I just waited. He didn't enter. He said my name once, quietly, not as a summons, but as a statement. I turned toward the sound and met his eyes. He said, "You're not afraid of me." I said, "No." He asked, "Why?" I said, "Because I've already lost more of myself than you could ever take." He didn't reply. He walked away. I stayed in the chair until the fire died. Until the room cooled. Until I could no longer pretend that stillness was the same thing as peace. Then I stood, folded the blanket, and went to bed. Alone. But no longer uncertain. The final morning came without ceremony. No grand silence, no mysterious weather, no shift in the wind that might have hinted at resolution. Just light. Ordinary, dull morning light, spilling across the floorboards and bringing everything into view exactly as it was. I woke early, but not because of a noise. I simply opened my eyes and didn't feel the weight of needing to close them again. There was no tension in my body, no nervous twist in my stomach. Only a kind of clarity, not sharp, not euphoric, just calm. The sort of clarity that follows a long, difficult storm, not because the world is suddenly right again, but because there's nothing left to question. I got dressed slowly, folding each layer over myself as if putting on armor. When I zipped my bag and placed it by the door, I didn't feel rushed. I hadn't decided what I would do with it yet. Only that it needed to be ready. Ready, not in case something happened, but because something already had. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm. The stove had been lit early, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and bread. My brother was seated at the table with a half-filled mug in his hand and a newspaper he wasn't reading. He looked up when I entered but said nothing. I joined him, poured myself a cup, and sat across from him. The silence was mutual. Not heavy, not aggressive. Just shared. After a while, he spoke. He asked if I had plans for the rest of the week. I said I hadn't decided. He nodded like he expected that. Then he told me the fence in the back still needed repairs, and the greenhouse would have to be cleared before the frost set in. I realized, in that moment, that he wasn't making conversation. He was offering reasons to stay. I didn't answer. I sipped my coffee instead. Later in the morning, I took a walk through the rooms of the house, not with any goal, but with the impulse of someone taking one last look before turning the page. Each space felt quieter than before, not empty, but observed. As if they were saying goodbye in their own way. The parlor still held the desk we had moved. The photograph of us was still on the mantel, my brother and I as children, standing too close, smiling too wide. The smile meant something different now. Not false, not wrong, just unexamined. In the library, I stopped at the shelf with the leather-bound notebook. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to read it again. I already knew what it said. More importantly, I knew why it had been written. And I knew what I had allowed by pretending not to know. Outside, the air was crisp. The sky held that strange, muted blue that comes just before snow. I stood at the edge of the garden, where the ground had begun to freeze, and let the wind pass through my coat. It wasn't trying to tell me anything. It was just wind. And that, too, was a kind of relief. When I came back inside, my brother was in the hallway, sorting through a box of tools. He looked up as I approached, one hand still gripping a wrench. There was something tentative in his eyes for the first time, not fear, not guilt, just uncertainty. He asked if I was leaving. I said I didn't know. He nodded, like he already understood what that answer really meant. Then he asked, "Will I see you again?" I looked at him for a long moment, letting the question settle in the air between us. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. Because I needed to feel what it meant to speak it. I said, "That's not up to you." His eyes flickered. He opened his mouth, as if to say something else, but then closed it again. I turned and walked away. In the upstairs room, I sat on the bed and stared out the window. The woods beyond the house swayed softly, the branches light and yielding. I watched a single leaf detach and drift downward, slowly, with purpose, and I wondered how something so simple could carry such weight. When I finally stood up, I didn't feel the need to look back. I picked up my bag, carried it downstairs, and placed it by the door. My brother wasn't in the room. I didn't go searching for him. Some goodbyes don't need words. Some stories don't end with explanations. I sat in the front foyer for a while, just watching the light shift on the floor. Listening to the old walls breathe. Waiting for nothing in particular. Eventually, I opened the front door. The air outside was colder now, but my hands didn't shake. I stepped through the threshold, not because I was running, but because it was time. Time to leave the house. Time to leave the story. Time to return to myself. And as I walked to the car, keys in hand, the wind picked up gently behind me, neither pushing nor pulling, just moving. Like me.